having a transparent, evidence-backed story behind why your business is sustainable and what the impact is, something that is specific and measurable, is absolutely crucial for a scaling green tech company, both for finding investment, finding new customers, and navigating a changing regulatory environment. The EU Green Claims Directive, the idea is to put a really tangible sense on what is greenwashing and what are the penalties for being involved in it. So we have businesses where the vast majority of their work is actively harmful to the environment, but the vast majority of their marketing is focused on the kind of green energy work that they're doing. Consistently announcing, getting the glory, as it were, about your sustainability claims, and then when it gets nearer the time, quietly taking it down and announcing another goal. That's a good example of that.
Yeah, so you are always a couple steps away, but you are not actually getting closer to the goal in a meaningful way. The solutions we need to save the planet from climate and biodiversity crisis are here, but they won't make a difference unless adopted at scale. We are Matt Jaworski and Katherine Keddie, and we focused our careers on ensuring this happens in time. Back in 2021, we started Adopter, Europe's first marketing company working exclusively with scaling green innovation. Since then, we've supported organizations from pre-seed startups and Airshot Prize finalists to international unicorns and global NGOs. We've worked with green tech solutions across fintech, construction, food systems, nature finance, and more. We also mentor on some of the world's leading venture builders, such as SOSV IndieBio, Carbon 13, and Conception X. We are on a mission to support 100 high-integrity green innovation solutions by the end of 2025 and 1,000 by 2030. This podcast is the next step on this journey. Today, in this episode, we'll be having a look at one of the probably biggest and probably also most important topics in the world of green tech, climate tech marketing, which is greenwashing. And most importantly, how to do marketing for your climate change solution without greenwashing. Without further ado, Kat, how would you explain what is greenwashing to a 5-year-old?
Firstly, I love this question because it makes you clear. How would I describe greenwashing to a 5-year-old? I would say it's when you are pretending that you're doing good things, but you're not, or you are lying about doing bad things by talking about the good things that you're doing and not talking about the bad things. Or you're doing good things, but you don't want to tell anyone about it, so you're lying by not talking about it.
It's spot on. What you could probably add to it is also this element, right, to get some benefits. So you do bad things, you don't talk about them because you don't want your parents to give you a punishment or maybe take a cookie away from you, or you want them to give you a cookie, so you talk only about the good things you do, but you never mention the bad things, right? Because then the parents wouldn't give you a cookie. And that's essentially what is greenwashing in the context of green tech innovation, and even more broadly, right? That's what businesses do when a company creates a new collection of sustainable clothing made fully out of hundreds of thousands recycled bottles. But then when you look into it deeper, you realize that they actually had those bottles manufactured to order so that they could recycle them, because that would give them the marketing benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's something that we're asked about in our work constantly. I think not greenwashing, or another way of putting it, is having a really clear evidence-backed story behind why your company or solution is sustainable, and the detail to be able to actually back that up is absolutely crucial for providing that and building that authority and credibility that you really need to get those early customers, investors, people excited and invested in your idea. So it's such an important topic, and actually Planet Tracker came up with 6 types of greenwashing, which I think are really useful because it's actually a slightly more broad term than you may initially think. So when you think about greenwashing, you think about people actively lying. But there's also other forms, which are, I'll go through in a second, but, that include talking specifically about the good thing that you're doing here and ignoring the bad thing, signing up for green initiatives and then not doing anything about it, pushing back your goals. So there's a range of different things. What I'll do now is I'll just walk through maybe the first 6 and then we can go through some examples.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we get started, what I remember now, and I think is very relevant to this conversation, right, is something I talked about in an interview with Dr. Alet Roberts, founder of Deakin Bio, currently rebranding to Deciln with our help. When we were doing interview for another of those episodes, which might or might not be out at the time someone is listening to this episode, depending on our publication queue, we talked about there being cases of companies maybe emphasizing their impact with good intentions, or maybe being unsure of their impact at the beginning of their journey and then getting stuck in, well, essentially impact washing and greenwashing as they scale. Not the case of that company, just something that tends to happen from time to time in just the broader tech space, right? The key point is that greenwashing does not have to be intentional. As you mentioned, there will be the cases of companies, I don't know, taking plain old concrete, putting a green leaf on the packaging, buying some low quality offsets from a distant part of the world, and claiming that they're selling now net zero concrete instead of having actual meaningful innovation. But there will be also cases of companies doing greenwashing by accident, unwillingly, or sort of getting stuck with it because of some decisions they made earlier due to, let's say, less rigorous impact or carbon accounting practices that don't scale as well as they hoped with their business's growth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the challenging thing is as well, previously this was seen as being kind of a nice to have to be really clear about your sustainability claims. But more and more it's becoming part of regulation. So you've got specifically within the European Union a new directive that's come through that focuses on this area. But you also have more questions being asked by specific investors, accelerator programs. Like, you have to be coming to these parties with a really clear case, evidence-backed case of why your solution is sustainable. And then obviously, some of the examples you gave are also, important for other businesses that are trying to, be sustainable and have a positive impact that are not necessarily climate tech. Yeah. So it covers a lot of different ground, I think.
Absolutely. And we already touched on a couple of those different types of greenwashing. I already dropped the name of impact washing. We touched on a few other types. Well, I think we should get right into it, right? So we align on the words. We can then discuss each of them in more detail.
Sure, yeah. So I will kick us off with green labeling. So that's, I think, probably the most obvious example that you think of when you think of greenwashing. It's saying this thing is sustainable for this reason, this thing is biodegradable, for example, but not having any kind of evidence to back it up. One example of green labeling that happened kind of over 10 years ago is there was a company that is known for selling kind of children's products, and they were making claims around the specific kind of materials that were in these products, and it turned out that those actually made a really small percentage of kind of the broad material mix that was within them. And that's something that you see quite often, where you say, okay, well, it's better because it's got this and this in it, but you're saying, okay, for that reason it is, and then give it a kind of sustainability label rather than work on the basis that it's actually only making up quite a small percentage of the material as a whole.
Yeah, so it's kind of like made with natural materials rather than made out of natural materials. And then when you look at it, actually it turns out that natural materials are a fraction of the product's content and not enough to meaningfully influence its sustainability.
Yes, absolutely. You've also got greenlighting, which is when you talk specifically about a really positive initiative you're doing while let's say 80% of your business is doing things that are actively harmful to the environment, but actually, that only makes up a very tiny percentage of your marketing, and all of your marketing is focused on one small green initiative that you're running.
Would you say that this could be an example of some oil companies at times sort of rebranding, trying to reposition themselves as hydrogen manufacturers, just focusing on not green hydrogen, but on those types of hydrogen that are derived from fossil fuels?
Yes, exactly. Great example. So we have businesses where the vast majority of their work is actively harmful to the environment, but the vast majority of their marketing is focused on the kind of green energy work that they're doing. So that would be a really good example. Aside from kind of the oil and gas examples that we just gave, there's also a lot of discussion around greenlighting in relation to some kind of larger banks, which say talk widely about their sustainability initiatives, and a vast percentage of their marketing is focused on those initiatives, but at the same time invest a lot of money to support industries that are not sustainable. So that's a commonly talked about example. The third one is green shifting, which is when you shift the blame onto consumers, and you actually don't consider those kind of bigger bodies like big corporates, for example, that have a far larger environmental footprint. We've also got green rinsing, which is revising sustainability targets. So if I have a big announcement where I go, we've got this really ambitious goal by 2030 that we're going to become net zero, for example, and then it gets nearer the time, and then we quietly take that down and then add up another one to the website.
We say that we're going to be carbon negative by 2040 now because we are pushing the envelope, we are becoming more ambitious.
Exactly.
That would be an example of it.
Consistently announcing, getting the glory, as it were, about your sustainability claims, and then when it gets nearer the time, quietly taking it down and announcing another goal. That's a good example of that.
Yeah, so you are always a couple steps away, but you are not actually getting closer to the goal in a meaningful way.
Exactly. Similar example is green crowding, which is when you sign up for sustainability initiatives, again, get the glory from doing that, and then don't actually do anything to kind of maintain that. So once again, you're joining an initiative, or you're kind of announcing your involvement with something that's well known to be sustainable, but actually you're not tangibly doing anything to reduce your impact or to create positive impact even with the businesses that we work with.
Absolutely. I think it reminds me of a news story I read, I know, a year, 2 or 3 years ago, about some group of big companies that came together to reduce, I think it was a specific type of plastic pollution in the oceans, something like this. Again, I think the broad example will still stand, even if I don't remember all those small details right. And after 10 years of this initiative, some, I think, journalists reviewed the progress results, and nothing was done. So there was the initial announcement, the launch of the initiative, good publicity for those involved with it. However, it has not led to any meaningful outcomes. Now, obviously, there will be some initiatives that lead to meaningful outcomes. However, those that fall under the label of green crowding, right? Those will be the ones that were a PR stunt from the beginning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then the sixth one is actually a bit more controversial, because I think, we always encourage the clients that we work with and the businesses and solutions that we support to be, evidence-backed and even conservative with their green claims, in that we would rather that they're clear, and we'd rather that we are 100% certain and they are 100% certain that this is the impact that they can make, than they kind of charge in with lots of claims, as, startups and early solutions tend to do, and then have a challenge. So the sixth one is focusing on greenhushing, which is the idea that because you are concerned about potential backlash from talking about the efforts you're making to have a good business and to be sustainable and to reduce your carbon emissions, you actually underreport your impact, which can be very negative for an industry as a whole, because you're not sharing ideas, you're not sharing progress, and that's considered another form of greenwashing.
Absolutely. I could see this becoming relevant, especially now with a lot of shifts in the public discourse and global international policy, especially led by the US, shifting away from ESG, uh, equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, and let's say such topics, right? Um, that some companies that are making meaningful progress in those areas might choose not to publicize it or share it as widely because they would be afraid of getting backlash from those, let's say, political movements or people who might disagree with this or in some way or for some reason be opposed to them.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's more broadly a challenge. And I would also say on the other side, there's a challenge broadly with the environmental movement where it sort of eats itself and there's a standard for perfection, which if not achieved is kind of criticized, which is also a challenge because realistically, if a business is making progress, there is a learning component to that. And,
Yeah.
we going net zero as a economy that's say in the UK is a huge industrial shift. It's a major change happening in a short time period, and that will involve some kind of learning process. And I think if we keep our achievements and our results to ourselves, or if we're worried because of this potential backlash to not talk about them, it holds the industry back and means that it's not as easy for us to achieve our goals.
It's kind of as if you were embarrassed to say at school that, or just not willing to say that you got an A at school because someone might point out that you didn't get an A star.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the fear of backlash is something that I think it's important from a marketing professional perspective to really understand that your claims are accurate and evidence-based and using the language that makes most sense and follows the regulatory demands that are coming into your region. But at the same time, that means you're confident to be able to talk about the benefits that you're bringing as a business or through specific policies, or if you're a climate tech company, the impact of your business as a whole, aside from just the kind of broad investment case or the benefit to the customer, what is the broader impact story that you're telling? And you have confidence to be able to actually tell that story.
Absolutely. So if you are transparent as a business, if you are working on meaningful innovation, then you will be also able to transparently communicate your progress without the risk of falling into any of those greenwashing categories from greenlighting to greenhushing, right? There might be obviously moments when it's too early for you to share it. You are working on verifying your claims. That's perfectly fine. That's different from greenhushing.
One of the reasons why it is so important if you're an early stage or a scaling green technology company that is going to raise, investor funding, to avoid greenwashing at all costs and have a really clear and transparent kind of carbon case that you put across to investors, is because it is a key part of their due diligence, specifically more those that are focused on green technology or this specific niche, but also more broadly as being seen as obviously a reputational risk, but also a risk when it comes to policy and regulation and customer expectations, all of the things that we've been talking about.
To jump in really quickly, it makes perfect sense that if a company, right, starts to engage in greenwashing, or maybe their way of impact accounting works due to some loophole in the current regulation systems, approaches, whatever, this is a risk for an investor because if that loophole gets closed, that company won't have any competitive advantage, won't have a place in the market. It will be wiped out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's I think that's a great example, but I think it's also a broad like trust thing. If you're, exaggerating the claims that you're making about your business, what else are you exaggerating? How can you trust or how can you authority build on the side of the startup? That's just, it makes it much more tricky.
Yeah.
And I think a good example of how important this is comes from Carbon 13, who are, the UK's top climate tech venture builder and accelerator. I know you're a domain expert, Matt, so you'll know a lot about this, but one of the things they do from the start, which I think is really important, is they look specifically to build ventures that have the potential to remove 10 million tons of carbon per year per venture. So that's the sort of scale that they're looking at. And one of the ways they kind of consider that is they really enforce at the beginning that you should be building your startup on the basis that you're going to have two kind of main tenets of your business. So there's the investor story. So, why is your business investor ready and how is it going to scale? And then the carbon story, which is how are you actually going to scale impact to reduce those 10 million tons of CO2 per year? And building this transparency and this kind of evidence-backed specific story about why you're sustainable from the start is a key thing that they, put across, and it's why their businesses are so successful and growing so quickly.
Absolutely. And it's great that they combine the sustainability impact with, well, something that makes a viable business, right? The investment case. Because sometimes, right, there is this old-fashioned perception of green tech as companies that deliver sustainable impact, but not necessarily real, tangible business benefits. While Carbon 13 ensures that those are companies that create both, and there is a valid reason to invest in them as an investor or to buy from them as a customer, in addition to just the sustainability impacts and results.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, green technology as a whole has reached a point when it comes to kind of maturity, to be able to have both the solution being much better than the existing solution and also much more sustainable. So those two kind of marry naturally together. It's cheaper to have solar energy now than it is to have oil and gas. These solutions are better, and that's because they're more sustainable. So I think having that kind of transparency and those two things married from the start is really valuable.
Exactly. So, as you were just saying, greenwashing creates risks to investors, to the customers, to essentially anyone who decides to adopt the technology or in any other way get involved with it. However, that's not everything, right? There is now progress in terms of the regulation that is bringing in penalties and consequences to companies that are involved in greenwashing. Would you like to give us a quick recap of those?
Yeah, sure. So the regulation is called the EU Green Claims Directive. I think it's a good example to talk about because it's really a pioneering framework for regulating greenwashing that is now being rolled out to member states in 2025. So very relevant, very timely. Obviously, it starts with the largest corporates and then will kind of trickle down. But what it means potentially for a climate tech solution that is scaling or earlier stage is that your customers will have to prove that the solutions that they're using to decarbonize are actually legitimate and are creating positive impact, which means that you will have to prove to your customers why your solution is genuinely impactful and helpful, both at the sales process, because it's becoming an increasing worry now that it's regulated, but also later down the line when it comes to, potentially having to do more reporting. So the EU Green Claims Directive, the idea is to put a really tangible sense on what is greenwashing and what are the penalties for being involved in it. So kind of key areas that it looks at are making sure that people are not exaggerating claims. You have to make sure that you're not being too vague. So you can't just say things are broadly sustainable without giving any kind of evidence or being specific.
Or green.
Or green, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So putting a little green leaf on something, for example, and saying that it's green is no longer enough.
Eco concrete or something like that.
Exactly. And kind of the other side of it is that you're no longer allowed to make accolades for yourself and advertise yourself as being sustainable if what you're actually doing is meeting the bare minimum standard. So, for example, if you say my product is recyclable and we care so much about the environment and we're really green and I make my branding green, and kind of lean into that as a marketing spin, but actually I'm meeting the bare minimum European Union requirements for recyclability for the product of my type and category, then that is greenwashing, because you're not doing anything above the kind of absolute bare minimum of what you're legally required to do.
So this would be kind of the case of a bog standard plastic bottle getting the label that, oh look, this plastic bottle is recyclable, while, well, all of them are, because all of them are made from PET.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Perfect. Wow. So big topic. I think we only scratched the surface of it, didn't we? Because we could be talking about it for a whole weekend, for a whole week. But we need to pause somewhere. We need to stop at some level, right, of simplified view of it. If we were to wrap up our conversation, what would you say are the key takeaways, and why does it matter? And how is it relevant in the context of scaling green tech companies?
That's a great question. I would summarize it as having a transparent, evidence-backed story behind why your business is sustainable and what the impact is, something that is specific and measurable, is absolutely crucial for a scaling green tech company, both for finding investment, finding new customers, and navigating a changing regulatory environment.
Perfect. And it's not something, right, that's relevant only to a story or a story you tell on the conferences that you put into a pitch deck. It's something that should be present across your entire marketing and sales activity. It should be present on your website. It should be present on your social media. And in all of those places, all of those channels that you are using, you should also make sure that you don't lean into the territory of greenwashing. So yeah, thank you very much, Kat, for this overview. It was great to, exchange thoughts. I learned a bit myself too. And for those of you who'd like to learn more about greenwashing, and most importantly, how to create impactful and authentic messaging that is free of greenwashing, make sure to go to our website where we have available a dedicated resource. You will find a link in the episode's description. Now, thank you very much, Kat, once again, and thank you all for listening in. Till the next episode.
Can't wait.